honor to introduce Dr. Dirk Lauinger. Right? Okay. He is a postdoc at MIT Energy Initiative and Sloan School of Management Operations Research Center, where he works with Professor Saurabh Amin. And before PhD, before postdoc, he graduated from EPFL in a PhD program of risk analytics and optimization. And he is an expert on all kinds of large-scale optimization, including integer, mixed integer programming, stochastic optimization, and robust optimization. And he applies these mathematical tools and models to very nicely formulate the operations and resource utilization problems in power systems. And he has very interesting works related to energy markets and operations of the power system and batteries, which are very important topic these days. So today he's going to share with us his works on optimization methods for policy analysis in reliable resource-efficient energy systems, the case for mobile electricity storage. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Mansi. And thank you all for attending this seminar. If you have any questions, then feel free to just raise a hand or put them in the chat on Zoom. Today we'll be talking about optimization methods for policy analysis. And why do I think that energy systems are an interesting topic right now, and why in particular resource efficiency and reliability timely? Well, you may recall the wildfire that we saw in Los Angeles last year. We know that with climate change, these extreme events will become more and more important. So how can we adapt to them? One measure is public safety power shutoffs, so rolling blackouts that are introduced by utilities to prevent wildfires. But of course, these have undesirable consequences because it means that a part of the population is periodically without power. And that's not something that citizens or voters particularly appreciate. So the California State Senate introduced a bill 2 years ago now called California Senate Bill 59. That gives the California Clean Energy Commission the ability to mandate that all new electric vehicles sold in the state be vehicle to grid ready. And that is seen as a resiliency measure, so that if you do have such a public safety power shutoff at home, you would be able to power your fridge, for example, with your car for a couple of hours that shutoff is going to happen. And so vehicle to grid has a direct resiliency benefit for these public safety power shutoffs. It also has a resiliency benefit if you think about global material supply chains and the concentration in just a few countries. So the US is a major oil producing country, but I'm from Europe, and there we are concerned about where our oil and fossil fuels come from. But now if you think about it, the supply chain of the metals that we need for electric vehicles and renewable energy is much more heavily concentrated than the supply of fossil fuels. So that may also be something to be concerned about. And then finally, why optimization? Well, we have seen phenomenal improvements in hardware. And these do enable us to solve problems that before are very hard to tackle. Now, this presentation was about making a case for mobile electricity storage. And I see that Willett Kempton is in the audience, and I want to give a shout out because he really popularized the notion of vehicle to grid. So the idea of using electric vehicles as batteries for the wider electricity grid. And now you may wonder, why is this a good idea? If I buy a car, well, I want to use it for driving. The reality is that most cars are parked most of the time. So while you're not using them for driving, you may be able to use them, or their battery to provide some services to the electricity grid. And historically, the mobility of these vehicles has been seen as a disadvantage because it introduces uncertainty on when and where these vehicles will be parked and what their state of charge is going to be. So now, I'd like to make you may want to make a claim that this mobility could be an advantage because it may align with electricity demand in such a way that electric vehicles or vehicles in general will be present when and where people are present, and thus be able to provide storage when and where it may be needed. Now, to make that case for storage, well, let's quantify the value that storage will bring to the electricity system and how it may depend on policy. To do that, we will consider several value streams. The first one will come from markets. And in particular, we will look at providing reliability in the EU and reliability and wholesale market participation in the US. And then there's also a value for which there may not be a market. And here again, we'll be looking at a different form of reliability in the US. And then in doing so, we'll have several methodological challenges. The first is that we'll need to translate policy into math. And by that, because electricity systems are considered critical infrastructure, so they're very heavily regulated. And we'll need to translate these regulations into a mathematical characterization that we can use for our decision problems. Then we'll be dealing with storage. So we need to deal with charging and discharging losses, which render the storage dynamics non-convex. And then finally, we would like to guarantee that the system be safe at all points in time and not just at some discrete points in time, which means that you'll have continuous time constraints or functional uncertainties. So that's the menu for today. You may wonder why do we need to differentiate between a market value and the non-market value for reliability. The reason is that historically, electricity companies, just like other network companies, used to be regulated monopolies. And they, well, in fact, electricity became a mass product thanks to economies of scale and complementary demand profile. So historically, let's say in the early 20th century, the larger the power plant you build, the more efficient you would be able to run it. So the cheaper the electricity would become, and the more diverse your customer base, the higher the utilization of your power plant would be, and again, the more cheaply you would be able to sell that power. So for a long time, that was the philosophy of the electricity industry. Build larger and larger power plants and attract more and more diverse customers. But that's somehow predicated on infinite growth, right? So it's reasonable. So as you might expect, this can't go on forever. And in fact, in the late 1970s, for a long time, we saw electricity prices increase, which you can see here. Historically, they first decreased, and people were really used to electricity getting cheaper and cheaper. Then it started to increase, and that led to a partial deregulation of the sector. And that was also the era of Reagan and Thatcher, so deregulation was anyway in the spirit of the time. And the idea now was to separate electricity generation from transmission and distribution and make generation competitive by keeping transmission and distribution as a regulated monopoly, because you wouldn't want to duplicate the infrastructure that you need to transport that electricity. Which means that you would have a market for the competitive part, but there would still be value for the transportation part, and this value would not be may not be captured by the market. Now we can see which jurisdictions have fully separated generation from transmission distribution. So these would be the blue states in the US and the European Union. Possibly other states as well, but these are the states that we'll be focusing on in this talk. Now, let's see how reliability plays out in practice. Again, an example from last year, the Iberian blackout. This blackout happened for two reasons. First, they lost a power plant on the peninsula, and then there were mistakes in how to stabilize the system after the loss of these power plants. And these two failure mechanisms directly explain the two forms of reliability that we will be looking at. The first one is called N-1 reliability, which means that you should plan a system such that you can operate it if any one component fails. So you need to oversize your system and have a certain redundancy. And then the second one comes towards stabilization. So this is what you do after a component fails. Then you need to stabilize the system. And one way of doing that is to rely on the frequency of the electricity system. Now, you may recall that our electricity grids run on alternating current with a frequency of 60 Hertz in North America and 50 Hertz in most of the rest of the world. And this frequency is an indicator of the balance between electricity demand and supply. So when supply exceeds demand, the turbines in power plants will speed up, and thus the frequency will rise. If demand exceeds supply, the turbines will slow down, and so the frequency will go down as well. Now, it is extremely important to maintain this frequency close to its nominal value, because otherwise the equipment may hit resonance frequencies that could destroy them. So in fact, the equipment will disconnect themselves preemptively from the grid if they experience large frequency deviations, which could lead to a blackout. We can now come back to our menu and be a bit more precise about what kind of reliability we are looking at. So we'll be looking at frequency regulation in the EU and N-1 reliability in the US. And we'll start with frequency regulation and see how that can be provided with vehicle to grid. And this will be a story about policies that prescribe what kind of frequency deviation trajectories you must be able to ensure if you're setting frequency regulation, and then the penalties that are in place if you're not able to deliver the power that you promised you would give. Then next, we'll be looking at N-1 reliability, this time through stationary storage. And this will be a story about how deregulation is good for competition, but maybe bad for coordinating investments. So let's start with frequency regulation. And throughout this talk, we will have this chain of reasoning. We'll have some kind of government policy that is supposed to regulate some market, and that market will give rise to a decision problem. We'll analyze the decision problem, and then hopefully be able to draw some conclusions about the policy that governs the market. So let's start with the market for frequency regulation. If you provide frequency regulation, then what you do is to measure the frequency in real time, and this provide power whenever the frequency is too low, consume power whenever the frequency is too high, which could be done by charging or discharging a battery, in which case you would always lose some power when you're charging or discharging. Now, there are different kinds of frequency regulation. The one that we are looking at here is called primary frequency regulation. And if you are delivering that type of frequency regulation, well, you first measure the frequency signal in real time and then pass it through the split ramp function in red. And then you adjust your power consumption, increase your power consumption by an amount that's proportional to the deviation signal that you measure. And the constant is the amount of regulation power that you promised to sell beforehand. So you can think of this as the output of a controller. And for this, you are paid in two ways. There's one compensation just for participating in this mechanism, regardless of how much power you actually need to deliver. And then there's an additional payment that's proportional to the amount of energy that's actually consumed. Okay, we can now formulate the decision problem of, say, a vehicle owner that would like to participate in this market. If you want to do that, then typically on the current day around noon, you need to decide on your market commitments for the next day. And these market commitments consist of two decisions. How much power to sell for frequency regulation and how much power to buy from the utility for charging. And to make these decisions, you need to plan the usage of your car throughout the next day. So you may, for example, say that between midnight and 6 a.m., you know for sure that you will be sleeping. So you reserve that entire time slot for vehicle to grid. Sometime between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., you know that you'll be driving to work. You don't know exactly when. So you are conservative and reserve that entire time slot for driving. And so on throughout the rest of the day. Okay, now we can choose our market decisions. So XB is how much power we buy from the utility for charging a car. XR is how much power we sell for frequency regulation. Now, these decisions should be piecewise constant functions of time, so that we can fit them into a market, and they must be non-negative. And of course, they must vanish whenever the car is reserved for driving. Once we have taken these market decisions, we can formulate the evolution of the state of charge throughout the next day, which is given by the initial state of charge plus the integral of the net power consumption weighted by a term eta that represents the charging efficiency. In fact, when the net power consumption is positive, only a fraction eta of the power flow enters the battery. Conversely, when the net power consumption is negative, a multiple of 1 over eta of the power that's owed to the grid must leave the battery. And then finally, if the vehicle is driving, we assume that it's discharging at a rate d. And we can now inspect this function, and we'll see that at any one time, only one of these three terms can be non-zero, which directly implies that it is not possible to charge and discharge at the same time. And then we also see that the state of charge function is concave in our market decisions and in the frequency deviation scenario, because you can replace these non-negative part and the non-positive part by max functions of 0, and then you know that the max of affine functions is convex. And here and then we flip the sign to make it negative.
So a clarification question. So delta is not decision variable, right? Only XB and XR are decision variable of the vehicle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So far delta is a parameter.
It's a stochastic term.
Yeah, so far we treat it as deterministic, okay. Later we'll treat it as stochastic.
Sure.
And then we also see that we also know that the state of charge function is non-decreasing in that. Another important ingredient for our decision problem is the total cost over the next day, which consists of the cost of buying power from the utility minus the profit or the revenue of providing frequency regulation. And we can now write down our decision problem, where we optimize over our market decisions, the cost over the next day, plus a cost to go function, that captures the value of the terminal state of charge, then subject to maximum charging and discharging rates, which are time dependent, and in fact must vanish whenever the vehicle is reserved for driving. And then lower and upper bounds on our state of charge, which you may set to 20 or 80% or so to make sure that the battery won't be excessively degraded. And now if we inspect this optimization problem from a methodological point, we see directly that the upper bound on the state of charge function is an upper bound on a concave function, so that's a non-convex constraint in general. And now let's assume that we somehow knew the deviation trajectory, the delta, ahead of time. Then you may wonder, how can we solve this problem? So we'll assume delta is piecewise constant on 10-second intervals, which it corresponds to the time resolution at which you must be able to deliver that frequency regulation. And in fact, normally it fluctuates rapidly around zero. Now then the textbook formulation for this complicated upper bound on the state of charge would be to introduce a binary variable at each time step. So at every 10-second time step, to distinguish between charging and discharging, which means that you end up with about 10,000 time steps. Whereas if you were able to formulate this problem on the time scale of market decisions, you would only need 100 time steps. So your problem goes up by a factor of 100. Your problem size goes up by a factor of 100. Well, how have people dealt with this? One approach is to sacrifice model accuracy for computational tractability. So, for example, they would linearize the charging and discharging efficiencies, either by setting them to 1, so saying there are no losses, or by allowing for simultaneous charging and discharging. And if you do that, then you can in fact solve the problem on the time scale of the market decision. The alternative is to sacrifice computational tractability for model accuracy. So that is we keep our nonlinear formulation, and then we solve a dynamic programming problem on the 10-second time scale. Now, what we would like to do ideally is to not sacrifice anything. And I would like to show you how we can succeed in doing so. And to do that, we now turn to policy. So far, we assumed that the deviation signal was known ahead of time, which of course is unrealistic. Because if that deviation signal was known ahead of time, then the grid operators would plan for it in the first place and wouldn't need to take out any insurance against this uncertain event, right? Now, it would be overly conservative to require that the frequency regulation cover all possible deviation scenarios. So instead, the European Commission specifies that regulation providers should make sure that the minimum activation period to be covered is to be between 15 and 30 minutes, and that they should ensure the recovery of their energy reservoirs as soon as possible within 2 hours after the end of the alerts. So there's some vocabulary here like alert states that will now pass. Here's a signal that we need to be able to ensure. At first, everything is fine. Then, let's say a power plant fails, the frequency drops to, or normalized frequency drops to -1. Now we must be able to deliver all of the power that we promised for a duration that's equal to this activation period between 15 and 30 minutes. Afterwards, we get a 2-hour break, and this 2-hour break plus the activation period together form what we call a regulation cycle. And at the completion of such a cycle, we must be able to cover another activation period. Now, mathematically, we can now introduce an uncertainty set that captures these kinds of trajectories. And in fact, these trajectories are the trajectories that map from our planning horizon into the interval -1 to 1, such that the cumulative absolute deviation from 0 over any interval of length the regulation cycle is no greater than the activation period. So if you want, you can think of this as a functional equivalent of the budget uncertainty set. With the difference that instead of vectors, our uncertain parameters are now functions of time, and we have uncountably many of these constraints, one for each quantum element. And then the EU regulations will tell us how to parameterize this set. We can now come back to our decision problem and make it robust. How do we do so? We first replace our cost by an expected cost. And here we assume that we have good price forecasts. So there's a lot of work on how do you estimate or forecast electricity prices. I'm not going into this. We just assume that these forecasts are available. What is more relevant for us in this talk is how we encode the legal obligation of being robust. And we do that by requiring that our constraints hold for all realizations inside the functional uncertainty sets. Which means that we face a robust optimization problem with functional uncertainties. And that may appear hard for several reasons. First, we have the non-convexity that we already mentioned, the upper bound on the state of charge. We also have now a robust lower bound on the state of charge. So how would you evaluate that lower bound? Since it needs to hold for all deviation trajectories inside the uncertainty set, that's equivalent to saying that the minimum state of charge taken over the uncertainty set must respect this lower bound. But now you're minimizing a concave function, which is again a non-convex problem. And then finally, we are optimizing over fairly arbitrary functions of time instead of optimizing over in vector spaces. And we saw that if we were to consider the deterministic problem, we would get a large-scale mixed integer linear problem. So we may expect that in general, if you inject uncertainty into the problem, it should become more complicated. Well, I will now show you that you can find an exact linear programming reformulation of this problem. And this reformulation relies on several properties of the uncertainty set. So first, we'll introduce several variants of this uncertainty set. First, a non-negative uncertainty set, and then a binary valued uncertainty set. Now we can have several propositions. The original uncertainty set is symmetric, meaning that a signal is in the set if and only if the negative signal is in the set and the absolute value is in the set, where both the negative part and the absolute value are taken at each point in time. And then finally, we have a total linear modularity property, meaning that if you had a concave function that you want to minimize over the non-negative uncertainty set, then there exists a binary valued optimal solution.
Why?
Perfect. That's what we explained now. So if you had a polyhedron and you were to minimize a concave function over a polyhedron, there exists an optimal solution at a vertex of the polyhedron. Okay. Now we can think about our uncertainty set in discrete time for a second. If you were to think about it in discrete time, then at least here would be linear constraints, so we would have a polyhedron. which would and we already have a concave function. So this would already suggest that there is an optimal solution at the vertex of that polyhedron, whatever this vertex is. So now let's characterize this vertex. Any discretization of this uncertainty set will be represented by a matrix, right? And these matrix will have only zeros and ones, and all the ones will be consecutive in each row of the matrix, which means that this matrix has the consecutive ones property, which implies that the matrix is totally unimodular. And now you know that if you have a polyhedron that's characterized by totally unimodular matrices, all vertices of that polyhedron are integral. But the only integers that are permissible, since we are taking the non-negative uncertainty set, are 0 or 1. So that means for any discretization, there exists a binary valued optimal solution. Now you can take a limiting argument to show that this also holds to the continuous time case. Okay. So now, why can we, why does it make sense to consider only the non-negative uncertainty set? That's because the state of charge is non-decreasing in delta. So that means, and because the uncertainty set is symmetric, it means that the optimal solution will be either to only choose non-negative values of delta or non-positive values of delta, depending on whether we are optimizing against the upper or the lower bound on the state of charge. And in the case that we are minimizing the state of charge, we then know that we can, instead of minimizing over the non-negative uncertainty set, we can minimize over the binary valued uncertainty set. And we know that since the uncertainty set is binary valued, we only ever need to evaluate our concave function in 2 points. So now here's an idea. Let's approximate this concave function by an affine function in exactly the 2 points that we're interested in. So then we are sure that we always get the correct value. And affine functions are concave functions. So we can take all the steps that we took to arrive at this result in reverse and recover our original goal, but now with a linearized state of charge function instead of an affine function. And we'll know how to choose the parameters of this linear function. And once we have linearized the problem, then we are allowed to average time. So then we are now that our constraints will exactly hold as long as we are at the endpoint of a time interval that will correspond to a market decision. Then we can take an argument from linear programming sensitivity analysis that also relies on the total unimodularity to show that this also holds for all points in between. And then finally, we have a linear program, and we can now evaluate it. So here is a backtest. This was before electricity prices went crazy in Europe in 2019, before COVID, before the Russian invasion. And in that year, with a Nissan Leaf style type of battery, we would have made about 140 euros in total by providing frequency regulation, which is not very much. Now you may wonder, can you do better? And in fact, yes, you can. If you just ignore the uncertainty set is prescribed by the law and sell as much frequency regulation as you can. And whenever you can't deliver, you pay a penalty. So you completely oversell frequency regulation. Then you more than double the profits. Now, a follow-up question may be, how large do the penalties for violating the regulation requirements need to be so that you are indifferent between overselling and respecting the law? And we find that they would need to go up by about a factor of 50. So in short, under the current market rules, it pays to violate the wholesale.
Does that depend on how much uncertainty a person's trajectory is? Like, for example, if I'm a person who stays at home all day, then oversell doesn't mean too much violation for me, right?
It would still, so here we have not considered any uncertainty on the driving.
Oh,
We
okay.
have only considered uncertainty on the needs of the electricity grid.
Oh, okay. Okay, sure.
We have, the way we have considered uncertainty on driving demand was by being conservative in
Sure.
scheduling.
Okay.
Quick question. Can you explain why the green curve look that way? Kind of like can you go back? Yeah, the green curve kind of like it drops on a specific day
Yeah.
and increase from time to time.
Yeah.
Does it mean that the day is the only violation? I think sometime between January.
Mid of, so this is the mid of January. Yes, so there was a violation.
Okay, so that indicates over the year, there's only one accidental violation.
There's not a violation here, but yeah, this is the main one.
I see.
Which makes it of, so this is the reason for which it pays to oversell, right? Because you're selling an insurance against extreme events. Well, by definition, extreme events happen very rarely. And you can only get caught by that you're overselling if such an extreme event happens. And then you may still be able to say, oh, sorry, like that was force majeure. Normally I would have been able to deliver, it's not my fault. So it can be quite difficult to catch this overselling frequency regulation. So that was the first part. We have quantified that value from selling frequency regulation, found it to be between 100 and 300 euros per vehicle. And we have dealt with the challenges that we had. Now you may ask, can we do better? The answer is yes, we can. So one option is to also participate on intraday markets, where you can react more quickly to the realization of the frequency deviation profile that you observe, and that more than quintuples profits. And then if you also participate on the ahead markets, you can increase them by another 30%. So that has been working well. So now I showed you my first plot was 2019. This year goes up to June 2024. But still, you can see that in the past, yes, profits were increasing rapidly, but recently they have been flattening. That's because there's so much storage in the grid now that these markets are starting to become saturated. So now you may wonder, what else can I do? Can I do better still? And this is where non-market reliability comes in. So here we'll be talking about N-1 reliability. Let us give an example of that's a Massachusetts example. So we have an island called Nantucket that's off the coast of Massachusetts. This island has a peak load of 60 megawatt. It has two subsea cables, 40 megawatt each. Now in, let's say 2017, this island was wondering, how can I meet my N-1 reliability requirement? If you evaluate that, you take the peak load, you say that one of these cables fails, then you still have 40 megawatts. So overall, you have a shortfall of 20 megawatt that you need to cover. And now they were evaluating two options for adding capacity. The first one, build a new subsea cable, another 40 megawatt for 200 million, or invest in a battery plus diesel combo to just cover this 20 megawatt shortfall, which would have cost 80 million. Well, they went for the second option. And yeah, the general idea will be, of course, that the more redundancy we have in a system, the lower the utilization of the system will be. And we'll see how this plays out in a second. But first, Nantucket was quite happy to have saved 120 million in their budget. But then, so this is now not Nantucket, this is a battery that's also on Cape Cod, close to Nantucket. They realized that these batteries they're just sitting around. On average, they're doing one charge discharge cycle per month, which is maybe what you would expect because these are redundancy measures, right? And in fact, they sit idle because of the separation of generation from transmission and distribution. So storage is typically considered generation. And if you are a utility, then you may be allowed to invest in storage as a reliability measure, but not allowed to participate in markets because there are fears that this will participate the market, because you're network operators, you will have more information than the average trader. But now you may wonder, okay, how much of a distortion may there be? And if you check the US electricity statistics, you would see that the amount of storage that's owned by utility is less than 1% of total US electricity generation capacity, which would suggest that maybe we don't need to be too concerned about market competition. And in fact, some states have started to experiment with allowing batteries to participate in markets. New York, for example, Maryland, and another one. And they have found that by doing so, the battery utilization goes up from once a month to about once every 4 days. And they have been also seeing quite some financial benefits in doing so. Okay, so now there's a question, a mathematical question on how we can incorporate market participation constraints into dispatch decisions. But in view of the time, I will skip that part and go directly to the results so that we have more time for questions. So the main or the important part, especially on Nantucket, is that we have correlations between electricity demand and prices. So Nantucket is a tourist island. Electricity demand peaks on summer afternoons. But the same is true for electricity prices in the broader Massachusetts grid. And now, if you participate in capacity markets, the scarcity events in 2024 at least also occurred on summer afternoons. Now you may wonder, in general, there could be a trade-off between using a battery for resiliency versus using a battery or any kind of storage for market participation. But you see that in this case, no, there is no such trade-off because it's pretty clear what you should be doing. In any case, you should be discharging your battery in summer afternoons. And then, in any case, that will be beneficial for your market operations. And if there is a contingency event, it will also help you take care of that reliability issue. Now we can evaluate that. Here's how you would operate assets on the island if you were not allowed to do any market participation, and if there was no contingency. The contingency means that the largest component in your system fails. And in that case, you would only be relying on the grid to cover your demand. Now, if you do allow for market participation, well, you would be charging your battery in the morning when electricity is cheap, discharging in the afternoon when electricity is expensive, as you might expect. So now let's see how this changes if there are contingencies. And well, then if you are not allowed to participate in the market, you would only discharge the battery in the hot summer afternoon when when one subsea cable is not enough to meet the demand on the island. And during the whole rest of the time, the storage or that battery would sit idle. But if you do allow for market participation, you see that the profile here is actually the same between if you're in a contingency or if you're not in a contingency, which again supports the point that there is no trade-off between market participation and operations for reliability purposes. And we can now come back to an investment problem and see how much money we would save by investing in storage in the first place instead of building that third subsea cable. So here we will find that we save about 4.7, about 5% of the total cost of operating and investing in the Nantucket electricity system over the next 25 years. But if we do allow for market participation, you can get the same kind of savings again. And you may think that 5% or so is not much, but this is 5% of 700 million for just one island in Massachusetts. And it is also true that this 5% on the investment savings is under current storage costs for batteries, but this would double if storage was free. And so this is where vehicle to grid comes in, because you may expect that when you need the vehicles the most in the summer, that's also when there are the most people on the island. So presumably when there are most cars on the island, so in the future, when there are electric cars on the island, then you may be able to tap into the electric vehicles of the people on the island to provide storage when and where you need it. And then you might be able to reduce system costs by, so this would double, this would go to 10%. You get the 5% of market participation by 15%. And that was my case for the value of mobile storage and how it depends on policy. And I would like thank my collaborators. And if you are interested to read up on this, then you can scan these QR codes, but also feel free to shoot me an email. It's my last name at mit.edu. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. Question from the audience? Yes.
I have a question about cost coefficient. So you have said that you assume there's like perfectly prediction model for this kind of cost, right?
Yeah, it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be good enough to take optimal decisions. Okay, so the difference is that you typically know that electricity prices will be high in the morning and in the afternoon and low during midday and at night. So you just need now you need to know if that price gap is sufficiently high to cover your round trip efficiency.
I see.
And if that is the case, then you basically already know how you should bid. But yeah, I did assume that we had enough.
I see. Your point is that if your prediction is higher than 1 living, I think you will get the same optimal decision in this case. And the second question is about the assumption of the regulatory signal. So you always assume that for the increase growth of that type, the role is always smaller than the constant gamma, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't assume that. That's what the regulators said. So what the regulators are saying, if the deviation signal falls inside the set, as you can verify, right? You can measure it, and then you can see does the trajectory that I have observed so far fall inside the set? If yes, then you should be able to deliver all of the regulation power that you promised.
Mm-hmm.
If no, then you can stop and you don't need to pay a penalty.
We have a
Yeah,
question
we have a
online.
question from the room.
Willett, can you try to ask your question, please?
Sure. Hi, Dirk. Nice to see you again. The kind of reserving vehicles for use for the grid. Your illustrative example, and maybe when you looked at later math, you already took care of this, but you're kind of looking at least for illustrative purposes, a vehicle reserving time to be available as a grid resource and reserving time for driving. But in fact, these are going to be aggregated resources with some kind of virtual power plant or aggregator, which takes a bunch of vehicles. And we found even when we were dispatching 30 or fewer BMW Mini E's with bidirectional capabilities, we could pretty much ignore the individual vehicles' preferences and times for driving because we were looking at an aggregate, and the aggregate didn't change that much per your first graph in the paper. And thanks for the nod to our work there. Vehicles are mostly parked, not driving, and so I'm wondering why you were looking at that kind of as a one vehicle owner. I mean, the label on the figure said vehicle EV owner, reserving time, but it may not matter in the math, as I say, when you put it into a larger formulation, but I just think it's probably a difficult way to think about it as EV owners are reserving. When we do surveys, take the sociology of it, people say, no, I don't want to reserve time. Suppose I have to drive then, so there's kind of a lot of buyer resistance to that as well. So just kind of your thoughts to that would be helpful.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, Philip. I absolutely agree with you that in practice one would aggregate multiple vehicles, and that by doing so one can these timing constraints become less binding. One could over contract to achieve a certain reliability or so. The rationale behind this approach, starting from a single vehicle, was to see how we would build up the speed. Thinking that, and you will now, you have the practical experience. So for me, it's more from the mathematical side. But the thinking is that the fleet of vehicles that you want to aggregate, you may have some past data on when they are driving, or maybe the user tells you when they want to drive them. And so then you could use these profiles to build up your bidding profile. And maybe you could even assign some reliability score on how well people have did in the past, that they were, or how well people have been at forecasting the driving behavior.
If I could respond, that makes sense. And what we've thought about doing is just how many hours you're plugged in. You're the individual EV owner. You just get paid on how many hours you're plugged in. And what you're suggesting is maybe a refinement of that. It would depend on what time of day. If you are plugged in at certain times of day, you get paid more than others. But as long as there's some kind of proportional payment to the amount that an individual EV driver is contributing to the overall aggregated resource, it seems, again, that you can kind of ignore the individual and not talk about the idea that I going to Berkeley, which is a long drive for me right now, I going to Berkeley would have to reserve time in advance, which kind of makes the whole thing seem a bit different from the individual EV perspective. Don't want to beat the horse there, but just think it's not necessary to talk about the individual driver and the gaps for them. You just talk about the aggregate, and again, based on that curve you showed in the beginning, how many vehicles are available and plugged in at any second of the day. So
yeah, I completely agree with that. I think, and I think it's also important to think about individual vehicles, because at the end we want to know how we should control them, right? And at some point we need to decide how we are controlling the battery of each individual vehicle. And so this, the formulation that we have here would give a recipe for doing so. Now, for sure,
Right.
if you're doing navigation, you can be smarter about that. You have more flexibility.
Yep.
There's a question in the chat, just if we have a moment. Justin Fish said, if distribution companies are permitted to participate in deregulated markets, how do you protect private investment into these deregulated markets? Acknowledging the advantages that distribution companies may have in optimizing pricing and bidding in such deregulated markets.
Oh yeah, that's a great question, Justin. So unfortunately, okay. The way that we set up the optimization problem, we can first so this is the slide that I skipped. When we set up our optimization problem, we can include what we call a market participation constraint. And when we include this market participation constraint, we can say that the utility is only allowed to use storage to charge or discharge storage if there is a contingency. So that means most of the time they are not allowed to use it. They're only allowed to use it for reliability. What we can then do is solve an investment problem for the utility with that constraint, which means that the utility will only invest in as much storage as is needed for their reliability. They will not be going and investing in storage just for participating in markets. So that drastically reduces how much investment they can make. Now you may still wonder that you may still be saying even these reliability investments, this should be in the private sector. So yeah, I agree. I agree that this can be a standpoint. In this case, the utility may want to look into how to make a contract to partner with third parties. From my conversations with the utilities, they have been skeptical about that because it typically involves granting access to their substations, and they may also hear that the third parties may make a mistake in how to operate the batteries, and that then they will be liable for the blackout, and they will have the bad reputation with the regulator of a blackout. But I know that you're working in this, and I'm very happy to see how you handle this in your contracts. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're at the time, but feel free to reach out to the speaker. Let's thank the speaker.